"You're too old to keep up, Claire. Italy's no place for women who nap at noon." He laughed, zipped his suitcase, and kissed his secretary goodbye right in front of me. "Tell me, how does a man steal your dream and still call it work? If you've ever felt invisible, stay till the end. This story is for you." "You're too old for Italy, Claire. You'd only slow me down." He said it casually, between bites of roasted chicken, as if he were commenting on the weather. But the silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The words hung in the air, slicing through the warmth of our kitchen like a cold blade. My husband Richard leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk curling at the edges of his mouth. Across the table, his secretary Melissa pretended to check her phone, but her lips twitched, betraying the smile she tried to hide. I remember the light above the table flickering, the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, the scent of rosemary I had sprinkled on the chicken. Ordinary details of an ordinary night. Yet that single sentence rearranged everything inside me. I laughed softly, because laughter was safer than silence. "Too old," I repeated. "You make it sound like I'm 80. He shrugged, still chewing. "Italy isn't for people who nap after lunch, Claire. Long walks, late dinners, crowded trains. It's not exactly a retirement cruise." I watched the steam rise from the food I had cooked, the meal he no longer tasted, the life we no longer shared. My hands trembled under the table, hidden from view. What he didn't know was that Italy wasn't just a trip to me. It was a promise. A dream we had built together, map by map, city by city. Venice for our anniversary, Tuscany for the vineyard we'd never afford, Florence for the art I wanted to see before my eyes grew too tired to admire it. That map still hung on the kitchen wall, dotted with red pins. Each pin was a memory. Each memory was mine. He raised his glass toward Melissa. "To new adventures," he said. I smiled, but something inside me cracked quietly, neatly, like fine porcelain under pressure. I didn't know it then, but that was the night my map stopped being a dream and started becoming a weapon. When the dishes were cleared and the laughter had moved upstairs, I stayed behind in the kitchen. The clock ticked past midnight, counting the seconds of a marriage that was beginning to dissolve in silence. The house smelled like candles and disappointment. On the table sat a half-empty glass of wine, the deep red reflecting the faint shimmer of the map on the wall. I looked at those red pins again, Rome, Florence, Venice, and felt a strange stillness, the kind that comes right before a storm. I had spent years making excuses for Richard's arrogance. He's just tired. He doesn't mean it that way. He still loves me. But that night, his cruelty wasn't hidden behind charm. It was deliberate, calculated. When I walked past his office, the door was slightly ajar. A suitcase lay open on the rug, half filled with shirts and neatly folded trousers. Next to it, a passport, 2 plane tickets, both to Rome. I froze. My pulse beat in my ears. My own name wasn't on either ticket. For a long time, I just stared at them, waiting for my mind to make sense of what my eyes already knew. He wasn't planning a trip for us. He was leaving with her. I touched the map on the wall, tracing my finger from Venice down to Rome, and whispered, "You promised." In the quiet, I could almost hear my younger self laughing, naive, hopeful, believing that love meant forever. What I didn't realize yet was that promises break quietly, but revenge begins in whispers. Sleep never came that night. I sat in front of the mirror, still wearing the pearl earrings he'd given me years ago. I looked at my reflection and saw someone I barely recognized. Lines around the eyes, a tired smile trained to hide humiliation. But beneath that reflection was something else, something stirring. On the vanity lay the small notebook where I kept grocery lists and travel ideas. I flipped it open to a page titled Italy. Beneath it, a list of cities, handwritten in careful script: Venice, Florence, Rome, Amalfi. Each name felt like a heartbeat from a life I had once believed in. Then I saw a note scribbled in blue ink from years ago, a line I had written after Richard's first broken promise. "Don't let him decide what you're capable of." The memory hit me hard. I remembered that version of me, the one who had dreams bigger than her fear. I walked back to the kitchen, turned on the light, and stared at the map again. The pins glowed softly under the yellow lamp. And then, without thinking, I reached up and pulled one out. Rome. The red pin fell onto the counter, its tiny click echoing in the still room. "I may be too old for Italy," I whispered, "but I'm not too old to start over." And just like that, the woman he thought was too old to change began planning her own kind of trip, a journey he would never see coming. If you've ever been told you're too old to dream, stay with me till the end. This story is for you. That night with the map should have been my warning, but the truth is, you never recognize the cracks while you are still trying to polish the glass. When I first met Richard, I was 51 and convinced that life had given me a second chance. My first husband had died young, and I had spent years alone, filling the silence with small routines. The bakery where I worked, the church on Sundays, the garden behind my little house in Springfield that smelled of lilacs every May. Richard arrived in that quiet life like a gust of spring wind. He was charming in a way that felt cinematic. The kind of man who smiled with his whole face, who knew how to make a woman feel chosen. He called me his calm in the storm. I called him my beginning again. I remember our wedding day clearly. The church bells rang, the air smelled of rain, and I wore a dress too simple for the occasion because I had stopped believing I deserved something grand. He slipped a silver ring on my finger, whispering that he would never take me for granted. The ring has long since dulled, a few scratches across its surface from years of dishwashing and garden work, but I still wear it. Sometimes I think I kept it on, not out of love, but out of habit, as if removing it would make all the years vanish too. Richard made every moment seem like an adventure in the beginning. He planned weekend drives to small towns and insisted we try new restaurants, even when the food was terrible. We laughed easily back then. I was patient with his temper, gentle with his ambitions. He was a man who needed to be admired, and I was a woman who thought devotion meant applause. It seemed to work for a long time. The first small fracture came one evening when we were hosting friends. I had spent all day cooking, decorating, setting the table just right. Richard arrived late from work, smelling of whiskey and compliments from his colleagues. When I tried to tell him about a new art exhibit I wanted to see, he chuckled and said, "You're not fun anymore, Claire. You used to light up a room. Now you just worry about details." The room laughed with him. I laughed too, because what else was there to do? But that sentence stayed lodged inside me like a thorn. I told myself he was tired. I told myself he didn't mean it. I told myself that love is about forgiveness, that sometimes you have to let the hurt slide past you. Patience, I believed, could fix anything, even pride. That belief was my slow undoing. Our home looked perfect to outsiders. A white house with green shutters, a neat yard, and laughter spilling from the windows. Inside, the silence between us grew like ivy, wrapping itself around the walls until I could hardly breathe. He became sharper with age, less interested in dinners at home and more in being seen. He thrived on attention, on admiration from others, and I became the quiet figure standing beside him at parties, smiling while he told stories that made him sound kinder than he was. I kept myself busy, volunteering at church, sending birthday cards to our grandchildren, making sure the bills were paid and the garden trimmed. If love was a job, I was the best employee anyone could ask for. But at night, when the house settled and the air turned still, I would stare at the ceiling and wonder when I had become invisible. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the man I had fallen for. When he was sick, I nursed him tenderly. When he lost a close friend, I held his hand through the funeral. For brief moments, he softened, thanked me, even smiled the way he used to. Those small flashes kept me holding on, the way a sailor holds to a fading light on a stormy coast. But each time he returned to himself, the light went out again. The worst part of losing love is not the day it dies. It is the years it stays alive in your imagination, long after the person beside you has stopped seeing you. I thought that if I stayed kind, stayed patient, he would remember why he chose me. I thought he would look at me one day and see not wrinkles but loyalty, not silence but strength. One afternoon, while cleaning his office, I found a drawer full of old photos. Most were of business trips, conferences, events. In one of them, taken years earlier, we stood side by side in front of the Grand Canyon. I was laughing, wind in my hair, eyes closed. He had his arm around me. Looking at that photo, I realized it was the last time we had truly looked happy together. Everything after that felt posed. I placed the photo on his desk, hoping he would notice it, maybe remember something warm. The next day, it was gone. He had tucked it back in the drawer, out of sight. That small act hurt more than his cruel words. The years rolled on like pages turning in a book I no longer wanted to read. The house grew quieter, the dinners shorter, his compliments rarer. He started spending more evenings, working late. I stopped asking when he would be home. We still shared the same bed, but the space between us was vast. I used to believe love was about endurance, about weathering storms, but the storms had stopped coming. What replaced them was worse, the calm of indifference, a silence that hummed like static, endless and cold. One night, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back had kind eyes but tired ones. I noticed the thin silver ring on my finger catching the light. For a moment, I thought about taking it off. I imagined the cool metal leaving a pale line on my skin, the mark of years gone by. But my hand froze. I wasn't ready to let go, not yet. The ring had become part of me, a quiet witness to everything I refused to say aloud. As I stood there, the house creaked softly, the sound of settling wood. Richard's car headlights flashed through the window as he pulled into the driveway. I waited for the familiar sound of the door opening, his voice calling my name. It didn't come. He walked straight to his study instead, the door closing behind him. The next morning, when I walked past that same door, I heard him on the phone, laughing again. That laughter used to warm me. Now it chilled me to the bone. I paused for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, listening. His voice was light, teasing, alive in a way it no longer was with me. I didn't need to hear the name on the other end to know it wasn't business. I stepped away quietly, the silver ring glinting faintly in the morning light. It was the last piece of the life I had built, and even then I knew, someday soon, it too would have to come off. But not yet. Not until I decided what kind of woman I wanted to be when I finally did. I used to think that betrayal came with shouting, tears, and slammed doors, but mine arrived quietly, wrapped in the soft hum of routine. Richard began working later, or at least that was what he said. He left before sunrise and returned long after the evening news had ended. He claimed the company had expanded its market and his presence was essential. I wanted to believe him. Believing was easier than facing the ache of suspicion. He was 55 then, a man who had started worrying about his reflection in mirrors. I would find traces of that worry in the faint scent of cologne on his collars, the gym receipts in his pockets, the whitening strips tucked into his drawer. He said he was just trying to stay healthy, but it felt more like he was rehearsing youth. One evening, while folding laundry, I noticed the faint smell of perfume on one of his shirts. It was floral, sweet, unfamiliar. I pressed the fabric to my nose again, thinking maybe it was mine, but it wasn't. My perfume was lavender, soft and understated. This was sharper, expensive, the kind that lingered like a whisper long after its owner left the room. I stared at the shirt for a long time before folding it and setting it aside. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone at work had hugged him goodbye, maybe a client, maybe an accident. That was how denial worked. It dressed pain in polite excuses. The next night, when he came home, I asked about his day. He kissed my forehead absently and said, "Exhausting, the company is sending me to more meetings now." His voice was steady, his tone confident, but his eyes didn't meet mine. I nodded, smiled, and served him dinner. Inside, a quiet unease began to grow roots. After that, I started noticing small things. His phone always face down on the table, the way he turned away when messages came in, the sudden importance of privacy, of locked drawers, of changed passwords. He would sit on the couch, scrolling, smiling faintly, the kind of smile I had not seen directed at me in years. One night, he left his phone charging in the kitchen while he took a shower. I wasn't proud of what I did next, but curiosity has a sound of its own, soft but insistent. I picked it up. The screen was dark, but a notification appeared. Message from Melissa. My breath caught. The name was familiar. She was his secretary, a bright young woman who had joined the company 2 years earlier. She had always been polite to me, sweet even, with her bright lipstick and her careful manners. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. The mere presence of it was enough to make my hands tremble. When Richard returned, I pretended nothing had happened. The phone disappeared into his pocket, and his smile returned, effortless as ever. That night, as he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and tried to recall when I had last heard him laugh with me, the way he laughed into that phone. I couldn't remember. The days that followed carried an edge of tension, invisible but sharp. Every time he left the room to take a call, I listened to the tone of his voice. It was lighter now, almost playful. The kind of tone people use when they are being seen, when they feel admired. Once, while watering the plants outside, I heard his voice through the open window. He was speaking softly, words I couldn't make out. But then came the sound that broke me. Laughter. A woman's laughter, light and familiar, spilling through the static of the call. Melissa. I stood frozen, the watering can tilted in my hand, spilling water onto the porch. I told myself not to make a scene. I had lived long enough to know that confrontation only gives power to the one who lies better. So I chose silence instead. Silence could be powerful too, if you learned how to use it. At dinner that evening, I asked him if he was still planning to attend the conference in Chicago next month. He looked up quickly, surprised that I remembered. Yes, he said, business as usual. Then, before I could say anything more, he added, "Don't worry, Claire, it's just work." That phrase became his favorite shield. Just work, just meetings, just colleagues. I began collecting those justs like little stones in my pocket, each one heavier than the last. Sometimes, I tried to catch a glimpse of his face when he was distracted. He looked younger somehow, energized. There was a brightness in his eyes that had nothing to do with me. Watching him was like watching a stranger inhabit the body of the man I once loved. I kept my routines, the way people do when their world starts to tilt. I baked bread, visited the market, talked to the neighbors, but inside, I was cataloging every detail. The smell of perfume, the phone calls, the missed dinners. I kept these things quietly, like evidence in a trial I hadn't decided to start. One afternoon, as I was setting the table, his phone buzzed again on the counter. He was outside mowing the lawn, the screen lit up with a photo. Melissa, smiling, a sunset behind her. My heart didn't race this time, it slowed. I picked up the phone, looked at the image for one long moment, and then set it back down exactly as it had been. When he came inside, wiping sweat from his forehead, I smiled. "Dinner's ready," I said. He didn't notice the tremor in my voice. That night, when he went to bed, I stayed awake in the kitchen. The house was quiet, save for the steady rhythm of the clock. I looked at the silver ring on my finger and thought of all the years I had spent believing that loyalty was the same as love. Maybe I had been loyal to the wrong person all along. In the faint glow of the stove light, I made myself a cup of tea and stood by the window. Outside, the garden swayed in the wind, the lilacs brushing softly against the glass. The smell reminded me of the early days of our marriage, when he used to bring me flowers just because. He hadn't done that in years. I sipped the tea slowly, thinking of Melissa's laughter, the scent of perfume, the soft excuses that no longer fooled me. The truth had started to take shape, even if I wasn't ready to face it. He thought I was too quiet to notice, too gentle to act. He thought patience meant blindness. But as I stood there, tracing the outline of my ring, I began to understand something he never would. A woman can be quiet and still be watching. She can be soft and still be preparing. She can be invisible and still be planning her return to light. And though I said nothing that night, the silence between us was no longer surrender. It was the calm before a reckoning. The calm before a reckoning has a sound. It is the faint hum of ordinary life trying to cover the noise of something breaking underneath. A week after that night in the kitchen, I decided to clean Richard's study. He had been away on another of his business trips, and the room smelled stale, a mix of paper, coffee, and that same expensive perfume I could no longer pretend not to recognize. His desk was cluttered with receipts, folders, and a travel brochure half tucked under a stack of files. I moved the papers carefully, not searching for anything specific, just dusting, organizing, pretending. Then I saw it. A thin white envelope peeking from between two reports, the logo of an airline printed neatly in the corner. I pulled it out, my hand suddenly trembling, as if my body already knew what my mind refused to believe. Inside were 2 plane tickets to Rome, dated for the following month. My birthday. For a moment I simply stared. The numbers and words blurred, the room seemed to tilt, and all I could hear was the faint ticking of the clock above his desk. 2 tickets. One name was his, the other was hers, Melissa. I sat down in his chair, the leather still warm from his last use, and laid the tickets flat on the desk. Rome, the city I had dreamed of visiting for 20 years. The place he once promised we would see together when we were older, when life slowed down, when time finally belonged to us again. My eyes drifted to the map of Italy hanging on the wall, a relic of that dream. I had pinned each city myself, tiny red dots marking all the places we wanted to visit. My gaze fell on Venice, the pin slightly crooked from the years. I remembered the night he promised to take me there, the way he said, "We'll go when we're old enough to appreciate it." I smiled then, thinking old meant wise, comfortable, still together. I didn't realize old would mean forgotten. The air in the room grew heavy. My fingers traced the edges of the ticket, pressing against the paper until my nails left tiny marks. My birthday. He was going to spend my birthday in Rome with another woman. For years, I had taught myself not to imagine the worst. I told myself that doubt was poison, that trust was sacred. But now, the proof sat in front of me, cold and undeniable. The pain was sharp at first, then slow, sinking deeper like water finding cracks in stone. When Richard came home that evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The map of Italy glowed faintly under the light above the counter. He kissed me on the cheek, casual, careless. "How was work?" I asked, my voice steady, too steady. "Busy," he said, loosening his tie. "Things are ramping up for the next quarter. Might have to travel soon." "Where to?" He hesitated only for a second. "Italy. Meetings in Rome." I nodded, watching him pour himself a drink. The sound of ice clinking in the glass filled the silence. "When will you be leaving?" I asked. "In a few weeks. Don't wait up for me. It will be hectic." He took a sip, then smiled faintly. "You wouldn't enjoy it anyway. Too much walking, too crowded. You know how your knees get." I kept my eyes on him, memorizing the way his lips moved, the way his eyes avoided mine. Every word confirmed what I already knew. He turned on the television, settling into the couch as if nothing had happened. The laughter of the news anchors filled the room, hollow and distant. I stood there with the dish towel in my hand, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. For a brief moment, I thought of confronting him, of throwing the tickets in his face and demanding an explanation. But then, I saw something in his posture, something that stopped me cold. He wasn't nervous or guilty. He was indifferent. That was worse. Later that night, when he went to bed, I returned to the study. The tickets were still there, untouched. I stared at them until my vision blurred, until the words lost their meaning. Then, I folded them neatly and placed them back where I had found them. I wanted him to know I had seen them, but I also wanted to see what kind of man would lie to my face after leaving the truth in plain sight. The next morning, the envelope was gone. At breakfast, he hummed softly, reading the newspaper. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "I did," I lied. "And you?" "Fine," he said, flipping a page. I watched him pour his coffee, the same routine we had shared for decades, the same motions, the same words, but none of it meant anything now. The ritual of marriage had become performance, and I was suddenly aware of every line I had been reciting. I looked at his hands as he reached for the cup. The same hands that had once built a life with me, now building a lie with someone else. After he left for work, I stood in the doorway for a long time, the sound of his car fading into the distance. Then I went to the living room and stared again at the map on the wall. The pins glimmered faintly in the morning light. I reached up and touched the one for Rome. My fingers trembled, but I did not cry. It would have been easier if I could cry. But there was no grief left, only clarity. Clarity that came with the cruel simplicity of the truth. I realized then that betrayal doesn't shatter you all at once. It erodes you quietly, like water on stone, until one day you wake up and realize you are hollow where you used to be whole. That afternoon, the phone rang. His number flashed on the screen. I answered, forcing my voice to sound calm. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Just checking in," he said. "Don't forget to pay the utilities, and I might be home late again tonight." In the background, I heard it. A faint laugh, light and melodic, the same laugh that had haunted me for weeks. "Melissa." I closed my eyes, pressing the phone against my ear, letting the sound confirm what the tickets had already told me. When he hung up, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the world outside continue as if nothing had happened. The sky was clear, the garden still, the air smelled of rain. Everything ordinary, everything unchanged, but something in me had shifted. The truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. It lives under the skin, whispering reminders with every breath. That night, as I turned off the lights and locked the doors, I looked again at the map on the wall. The red pins shimmered softly in the dim light, and I felt something harden inside me. Not bitterness, not yet. Something sharper. I whispered to the empty room. You can have Rome, Richard, but you'll never know what you left behind. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to power stir quietly in my chest. For a long time, I had mistaken endurance for strength. But strength is not about how much you can bear. It is about when you decide to stop bearing it. That night, after I whispered to the empty house, I sat down at the kitchen table. The clock ticked softly above the stove, its rhythm steady, indifferent to the storm that had begun inside me. I reached for the small notebook I had kept tucked in a drawer for years, the same one where I used to jot down grocery lists and recipes. Its pages were worn, corners bent, filled with little reminders of the life I had built around Richard. But tonight, I opened it to a blank page. The pen I picked up was an old fountain pen with blue ink, the shade of a summer sky over Tuscany, the color of freedom. I pressed the tip to the page and began to write. House, car, accounts, pension. My hand trembled at first, but the more I wrote, the steadier it became. I whispered the words aloud, letting each one settle in the air like a vow. My name is on every line. For once I didn't cry. I wrote. There was something sacred in that act. For years, I had written things to please him. Reminders, notes, shopping lists, invitations. Now, I was writing for myself. Each word was a small rebellion, a quiet declaration that I still existed. I sat there for hours, adding details, numbers, contacts, things I remembered from years of being the one who kept our life organized while he played the part of success. I knew where everything was. Every account, every insurance policy, every asset that bore both our names. He had built his image, but I had built the foundation beneath it. When I finally looked up, the first light of dawn was touching the window. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I felt exhausted but strangely awake. The map of Italy on the wall caught the pale glow of morning, and the color of the ink on my page matched the sky above it perfectly. That morning, when Richard left for work, I stood in the doorway as he backed the car out of the driveway. He honked once, the way he always did, a habit from the early years that had somehow survived long after affection had faded. I watched the car disappear around the corner, then turned back inside. I made coffee, poured it into my favorite mug, and sat down again with the notebook. The list stared back at me. It looked simple, ordinary, but I knew it was the beginning of something irreversible. I added one more line at the bottom of the page. Freedom. That word glowed against the paper like a spark in the dark. I started with the car. It was a red Ford Mustang, sleek and loud, the kind of car that made him feel young again. He treated it like a trophy, polishing it every weekend, boasting about it to friends. I had never liked it. It felt like an extension of his vanity, a mirror reflecting the man he wanted the world to see. I called a local dealer, a man named Ben, who had helped me sell an old station wagon years before. He was kind, the kind of person who didn't ask too many questions. You sure about this, Mrs. Henderson? He asked. It's a fine car. I'm sure, I said. It's time for it to belong to someone who actually needs it. He came by 2 days later, walked around the car, and nodded. The transaction was quick. I signed the papers in blue ink, the same pen from my list. As the car rolled out of the driveway, I watched it go without regret. I felt lighter, as if a piece of his shadow had lifted from me. Next came the accounts. For years, Richard had trusted me with the household finances. He liked to think of himself as the provider, but I was the one who paid the bills, tracked the statements, kept everything running smoothly. He never looked closely, confident that I would never dare touch the money. At the bank, the teller recognized me immediately. Good morning, Mrs. Henderson, she said kindly. What can we do for you today? I'd like to make a withdrawal, I replied, sliding the joint account card across the counter. How much? She asked. All of it. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. All of it? I nodded. My voice didn't waver. Yes, every dollar. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and began typing. The printer whirred, and moments later she handed me a cashier's check. The paper felt warm in my hands, as if it carried the pulse of everything I had endured. I placed it in my purse and smiled politely. When I walked out of the bank, the sunlight felt different, sharper, real. I stopped at a cafe on the corner and ordered a cup of coffee. I sat by the window, the check folded neatly beside me, and thought about all the mornings I had spent waiting for him to come home. I was done waiting. The last step was the lawyer. I had met Nancy once before at a community event. She was calm, confident, with silver hair and eyes that looked like they had seen everything and still managed to believe in justice. I called her office that afternoon and scheduled a meeting. She greeted me warmly, ushering me into her office filled with books and soft light. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Henderson?" she asked. I hesitated for only a moment. "I want to know what happens when a woman decides she's had enough." She smiled gently, as if she had heard those words many times before. "Then let's talk about what you deserve." We spent 2 hours going over everything: the house, the accounts, the car, the pension. When I was finished, she leaned back in her chair and nodded. "You've already done the hardest part," she said. "You made the decision." Hearing it said aloud made something inside me unclench. The decision. For years, I had waited for Richard to change, to notice me, to see me. But the power to change my life had always been in my own hands. As I left her office, the afternoon sun poured through the glass doors, warm and golden. I felt the weight of years lifting with each step. I had thought freedom would feel loud, triumphant, but it didn't. It felt quiet, like the slow, steady rhythm of breathing after holding your breath for too long. That evening, when Richard called, his voice was brisk. "I'll be home late again. Don't wait up." I smiled to myself. "I won't." After I hung up, I opened the notebook again. I drew a small blue check mark next to each item on the list: house, car, accounts, pension, freedom. Outside, the last light of day settled over the garden. The air smelled of lilacs again, the same scent that had once carried memories of love. Now it carried something else, the promise of beginning. And for the first time in years, I realized I was not afraid of being alone. I was afraid of ever losing myself again. The morning after I met with Nancy, I woke before sunrise. The world outside was still gray, caught between night and day, that soft, uncertain hour when everything feels possible. I stood in the doorway of the garage, looking at Richard's red Mustang one last time. The car gleamed under the faint light, its surface so polished it seemed to hold a reflection of the sky. He had loved that car more than he had loved anything in recent years. It was his proof of youth, of control, of worth. The day I sold his car, I felt the ground shake, not from fear but relief. I remember sliding the keys off the hook by the door. They were heavier than I expected. Every jingle of metal echoed in the empty house like a memory. I could almost hear him laughing, the way he did whenever I asked if I could drive it. "This car's too powerful for you, Claire," he would say, patting the hood like a loyal dog. "Besides, it takes a certain touch." I had watched him polish it every weekend, his movements precise, careful, obsessive. It had become a ritual of vanity, one I had quietly resented but never interrupted. Now, standing there with the keys in my hand, I realized the car wasn't just a symbol of him. It was a symbol of everything he had taken from me: the confidence, the joy, the right to move without permission. Ben, the dealer, arrived just after 8. The sun had risen fully by then, spilling gold across the driveway. He walked around the car, whistling softly. "Still in perfect condition," he said. "Yes," I replied, watching the light reflect off the hood. "It's always been taken care of." He smiled, sensing my detachment. "You sure you want to sell it? It's a beauty." "I'm sure," I said, my voice even. "It belongs to someone else now." He nodded and filled out the papers. The pen scratched across the surface, and I signed my name carefully, every letter steady. When he handed me the envelope of cash, it felt warm in my hands. I slipped it into my purse without counting it. The value of that moment had nothing to do with numbers. As Ben started the engine, the Mustang came alive with its familiar low growl. I stepped back as it rolled down the driveway. The sunlight glinted off the windshield, a brief flash like the blink of an eye, and then it was gone. The sound of the engine faded into the distance until all that remained was the quiet hum of morning. I stood there for a long time, the keys still in my hand. They were useless now. I opened my palm, and one slipped through my fingers, hitting the tile floor of the garage with a sharp, metallic ring. The sound was small but final. It echoed like the closing of a door. When I turned back toward the house, I felt lighter. For years, every decision I made had carried the weight of him, of what he wanted or expected. Now, each step I took was my own. Inside, I brewed coffee, the smell filling the kitchen. I poured a cup, sat at the table, and stared out the window. The garden shimmered in the early light, dew resting like glass beads on the leaves. Everything looked ordinary, yet everything had changed. The notebook sat beside me, the page with the list still open. I drew a slow line through car. Outside, a soft wind stirred the lilacs. I imagined it carrying away the sound of that engine, the echo of every word he had ever used to make me feel small. Later that day, I went for a walk through town. The air was crisp, and the world seemed strangely bright. I passed the cafe where we used to sit on Sunday mornings. The waitress recognized me and waved. "You're out early today," she said. "Yes," I replied. "It's a good morning for a change." I ordered a cup of coffee and sat by the window, the sunlight painting soft lines across the table. For the first time in years, I didn't check the time, didn't think about when I needed to be home. I simply sat and watched the world move. Couples walking their dogs, children chasing pigeons, a young woman laughing into her phone. The sound of her laughter didn't sting me the way Melissa's had. It felt different, hopeful, alive. I left a generous tip on the table and walked to the park. The trees were beginning to change color, the first hints of autumn curling at their edges. I stopped by a bench and sat down, feeling the wind move through my hair. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, as if I could finally exhale everything I had been holding inside. When I returned home, the house no longer felt like his domain. It felt like mine. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. I opened the windows, letting the breeze move through the rooms. The curtains swayed softly, and the scent of lilac mingled with coffee and sunlight. I spent the afternoon cleaning, not out of duty, but because I wanted to reclaim the space. Every drawer I opened, every shelf I dusted, felt like an act of ownership. When I reached the study, the one that had once been forbidden to me, I paused. The desk was bare now, the tickets gone, the lies scrubbed clean. I opened the drawers one by one, removing the last traces of his presence. Old receipts, half-empty pens, a forgotten tie. I folded the tie carefully and placed it in a box. Then I shut the drawer and locked it. As the light began to fade, I sat down at the desk with my notebook. The pen lay beside it, still full of blue ink. I dipped the nib and wrote slowly, savoring the sound of the paper beneath it. Today, I sold his car. Today, I learned that freedom can be quiet. I closed the notebook and looked around the room. For years, I had believed that strength looked like endurance, that silence meant peace. But real strength, I realized, comes from the moment you stop waiting for someone else to save you. Outside, the sky was streaked with gold and pale pink. The last of the daylight brushed against the map of Italy still hanging on the wall. I stood and touched it gently, tracing the outline of Rome with my finger. The paper felt cool under my skin. If you are still watching, tell me, what would freedom taste like to you? For me, it tasted like courage. That night, I slept deeply. There were no dreams, no ghosts of old promises, no sounds of laughter I could not place, only stillness. And when morning came, it felt like the first morning of my life. The first morning after he left for Rome, the house was filled with silence. Not the kind that presses down like a weight, but the kind that breathes. I opened the curtains and let the sunlight spill into every corner. Dust shimmered in the air, tiny golden flecks floating like new beginnings. The clock ticked softly, the coffee pot hissed, and for the first time in years, those small sounds felt like company. He was in Rome, chasing sunsets. I was home, chasing myself. I carried my mug to the porch and watched the light stretch across the garden. The air smelled of wet earth and lilac, the same flowers that had once marked the beginning of our marriage. Now they marked something different. I had decided that morning to plant new things, things that belonged only to me. I cleared a small patch of soil behind the house and began to work, my hands sinking into the dirt. It felt grounding, raw, almost holy. I planted a row of white daisies, my favorite. When I was a girl, I used to make crowns out of them and pretend I was queen of the yard. Now, in my late 60s, I planted them not for play, but for peace. As I pressed each root into the earth, I whispered small truths to myself. I am still here. I am still growing. The days that followed moved slowly, but not painfully. I began to rediscover a rhythm that belonged to me alone. I woke early, made breakfast for one, and no longer rushed to clear the dishes. The television stayed off. Instead, I filled the house with music, the kind I used to play before he complained that it distracted him. The notes of an old piano piece drifted through the rooms, soft and imperfect, but mine. In the afternoons, I joined a painting class at the community center. It was a place filled with older women and a few men who all seemed to be carrying invisible stories. The instructor, a kind man named Leonard with paint under his fingernails, encouraged us to forget perfection and just feel the color. I hadn't held a brush in years, not since high school. My first stroke on the canvas trembled, but then my hand found a rhythm. I painted fields of green, skies of blue, faces of women who looked like me but were freer, lighter. Sometimes Leonard would stop behind me, tilt his head, and say, "You've got an eye for peace, Claire." No one had complimented me like that in decades, not for something that came from me. I would smile, quietly, because I could feel myself beginning to bloom again. Back home, my little garden thrived. The daisies grew faster than I expected, taller too, as if they were racing toward the sun. Each morning I walked among them, touching their petals, breathing in their scent. They became my Tuscany, a tiny version of the dream I once had. I no longer needed vineyards or Italian skies. Beauty had always been possible here, in the soil under my feet. One evening, as I stood by the window, I watched the sky turn gold and then lavender. The setting sun spilled through the curtains, landing on the half-finished painting in the corner of the room. It was a landscape I had started in class, a wide meadow with a winding path disappearing into the horizon. I stared at it for a long time, realizing the path had no end. I liked it that way. Sometimes I still thought of him. It's impossible not to. Decades of habit do not vanish overnight. I wondered if he ever thought of me while walking those cobblestone streets, if he ever felt the absence of what he had left behind. Then I reminded myself that it no longer mattered. His absence had made space for me to return to myself. The neighbors began to notice the change. Mrs. Thompson from next door waved one morning and said, "You look different, Claire, happier." I smiled and told her the truth. "I think I am." In the quiet evenings, I would sit outside with a cup of tea and my sketchbook. The air would cool, and the stars would begin to appear, one by one. I drew what I saw: the curve of the fence, the shapes of the leaves, the way the moonlight touched the petals of my daisies. Each drawing felt like a small promise to myself that I would keep going. There were moments of loneliness, of course. Nights when the bed felt too large or the silence too deep. But even in those moments, I felt stronger than before. Loneliness, I learned, is not the same as emptiness. It is space, and space can be filled with something new. One night, after finishing a painting, I took a step back and looked at it under the kitchen light. It was not perfect. The brush strokes were uneven, the lines soft, but it was alive. I could see movement in it, the kind that comes from finally understanding what peace feels like. I hung it in the hallway, right where his framed certificates used to be. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of my life became something gentle and sure. Every morning began with coffee and sunlight through the curtains. Every afternoon was spent in the garden or at the studio, my hands always busy with something that grew. Every night ended with quiet, the kind that felt earned. One morning, as I watered the daisies, I noticed a butterfly resting on one of the petals. Its wings shimmered with gold and white. I stood still, afraid to scare it away, and then it lifted, hovering for a moment before drifting toward the open window. It was such a small thing, but I felt tears fill my eyes. Not tears of sadness, tears of recognition. That fragile creature, rising from something ordinary, felt like a reflection of me. He was in Rome, chasing sunsets. I was home, chasing myself. And every day, I was finding her. The woman I had buried under duty, the woman who once dreamed of Italy, the woman who now knew she didn't have to cross an ocean to begin again. She was here, in the soil, in the color on her canvas, in the air that finally felt like her own. I took one last look at the garden before heading inside. The daisies stood tall, their petals turned toward the morning light. I smiled and whispered, "Grow, just a little more." And somewhere deep inside, I felt myself doing the same. The daisies in my garden had begun to bloom wildly, bending under their own brightness, when the phone rang one afternoon. I had been sitting by the window, watching the light shift across the leaves, when I saw his name flash on the screen. For a moment, My heart stumbled in my chest, not out of love but out of habit. I almost let it ring, but then I answered. "Hello, Claire." His voice came through, smooth and distant. "Just checking in. How are you?" I could hear the echo of street noise behind him, the faint murmur of people speaking Italian. Then came it, the sound that had haunted me once before, a woman's laughter, light and familiar, threading through his words like perfume in the air. "Melissa, I'm managing," I said softly. "And you?" He hesitated for a second, then chuckled, that rehearsed tone of a man who wanted to sound busy, successful, unbothered. "Busy, as always. Italy's incredible. You'd love it here." I closed my eyes and let a strange calm settle over me. "I'm sure I would," I replied. "Enjoy your trip, Richard." He said something else, something about the meetings and the food, but I was no longer listening. The call ended soon after, and I stood there, the phone still in my hand, the dial tone humming in the background. The garden swayed outside, white petals trembling in the wind. He called once from Florence. I could hear her laughter behind him. That night, I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my laptop and found an email from him. It was short, written in the same brisk tone he used when talking to his coworkers. "I hope you're managing fine." The words sat on the screen, so empty they almost made me laugh. I clicked reply and typed only 4 words. "Better than you think." Then, I hit send and closed the computer. There was power in brevity, I realized. He didn't deserve explanations, not anymore. Over the next few days, the world outside continued to move with its usual rhythm, but inside me, something was shifting. It was not rage, not even sadness. It was focus, the kind that comes before a great change. I began sorting through the last pieces of business that tied me to him. Letters from the bank, papers from the lawyer, documents waiting for signatures. Every envelope I opened felt like another door creaking shut. Nancy called the following Monday. "Claire," she said, her voice calm and sure. "Everything's ready. All we need now is your signature." I stared at the phone in my hand for a long moment. It was a simple request, but the weight of it pressed against my chest. Signing those papers would mean the end of nearly 3 decades of my life. It would also mean the beginning of something entirely my own. "I'll come by tomorrow," I told her. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed, the sheets cool against my skin, my thoughts flickering between the past and the uncertain future, waiting just beyond the next day. I thought of the map of Italy, still hanging in the hallway, and the small patch of garden that had become my Tuscany. I had not removed the map yet. I wasn't ready, but I knew that soon I would. Morning came pale and quiet. I dressed simply, in a cream blouse and a navy cardigan, the one I always wore when I needed courage. The blue of the fabric matched the ink of my pen, the one I had used to write my list weeks ago. When I arrived at Nancy's office, she greeted me with a kind smile. "You look well," she said. "I feel steady," I replied. She nodded and handed me the documents. The room was bright with sunlight filtering through the blinds. I sat down at the oak desk, the papers spread out before me. My fingers brushed the top page, the letters of my name printed neatly across the lines. Claire Henderson v. Richard Henderson. For a moment, I traced the letters with my fingertip. I thought of the woman who had stood beside him through every storm, who had believed that loyalty could fix loneliness. That woman deserved more than what she got, but she had also given me the strength to become the person sitting here now. Nancy placed a pen in front of me. "Take your time," she said quietly. I picked it up. The pen was heavy, cool against my fingers. Blue ink, the color of the sky I had dreamed of in Italy, the color of beginnings. I drew in a breath, steady and full, then pressed the tip to the paper. My signature flowed smoothly, confident, final. As I lifted the pen, I felt something loosen inside me. The sound of ink sliding across paper was soft, but it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. When I looked up, Nancy smiled. "That's it," she said. "It's done." The words echoed in the quiet office, simple but immense. "It's done." I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. "Thank you," I whispered. "You've done the hardest part, Claire," she said. "You let go." I left the office and stepped into the sunlight. The world looked sharper somehow, edges clearer, colors brighter. I walked slowly to my car, feeling the breeze lift the hair from my neck. Everything felt lighter, as if gravity itself had eased its grip. When I reached home, The garden greeted me in full bloom. The daisies were taller than ever, their white petals wide and open to the sky. I knelt beside them, touched one gently, and smiled. They had grown faster than I expected, almost impatiently, as if they too had been waiting for this moment. Inside, I placed the signed papers on the kitchen table and set the pen beside them. The blue ink stained my fingertip, a tiny reminder of the decision that had changed everything. I looked around the room, at the walls that had heard so many arguments and apologies, at the map of Italy still hanging in the hallway. It was time. I walked over, stood before it, and studied the red pins one last time. Rome, Florence, Venice. Each one marked a dream we once shared. I reached up and touched the pin for Venice, the one slightly crooked from years of dusting. Then I pulled it out. One by one, I removed the rest until the map was bare, only faint holes remaining. The wall looked empty, but I didn't. The emptiness felt honest, clean, waiting to be filled with something real. I folded the map carefully and set it aside. The sound of paper rustling was quiet but final, the way a chapter closes when you stop rereading it. Outside, the wind picked up. The daisies swayed in rhythm, their petals catching the afternoon light. I watched them for a while, then turned off the lights and let the house rest in the soft glow of sunset. He was in Florence, pretending to live the life he thought he wanted. I was here, living mine, finally ready for whatever came next. And though the air was still, it hummed with something invisible, something alive. The calm before the storm was no longer frightening. It was the sound of freedom waiting to be spoken aloud. The calm before the storm lasted only a few days. It ended the moment I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel outside the house. I was in the kitchen, rinsing paintbrushes in the sink, when I froze. The sound was unmistakable. I looked up and saw through the window the taxi idling by the gate, the driver unloading a single suitcase. He was home. Richard stepped out, tanned and confident, wearing a crisp white shirt that looked freshly pressed. His sunglasses caught the light as he waved the driver away. He pulled his suitcase behind him, the wheels clicking rhythmically on the path, the sound growing louder until it filled the air. I stayed where I was, calm and unmoving. I had imagined this moment so many times, and now that it was here, I felt strangely steady, as if every breath I had taken in the past month had been preparing me for this. The door opened. "Well," he said, dropping his bags in the hallway. "Home sweet home." His voice carried that same casual arrogance that had once filled every room. He looked around, expecting the house to greet him the way I once had, expecting me to rush forward with a smile, to ask about his trip, to pretend everything was fine, but I did not move. He glanced toward the wall in the hallway, the one that had held the map of Italy for decades. The space was empty now, pale against the rest of the wall, faint outlines where the map had hung for years. He stopped mid-step. "Where's the map?" he asked. I wiped my hands with a towel and turned slowly to face him. I took it down. His brow furrowed. "Why would you do that?" I met his gaze evenly. I didn't need it anymore. He blinked, clearly thrown by my composure. Then his eyes darted to the window, to the empty driveway beyond it. His face shifted, sharp with realization. "Where's my car?" he demanded. "Gone," I said simply. He stared at me, his jaw tightening. "Gone? What does that mean?" "I sold it." "You what?" He stepped closer, his voice rising. "You had no right to do that. That car was mine." I took a deep breath, keeping my tone level. "It was ours. And now it's not. It's gone." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. "You have completely lost your mind." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I've finally found it." He let out a dry laugh, the kind that wasn't really laughter at all. "You're not funny, Claire. Where's the money?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Mine now." His eyes widened. "What did you just say?" "Mine," I repeated. "Every dollar, every cent. The accounts were joint, remember? I just took what was already mine." He stepped closer until the air between us felt charged, heavy. "You can't do this." I met his gaze without flinching. I already did. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was almost unbearable. Then, slowly, I turned and walked to the kitchen table. On it sat the rolled-up map of Italy, tied neatly with a blue ribbon. I picked it up and held it out to him. "You might need it more than I do," I said softly. He stared at it, not taking it. his mouth opening but no words coming out. The muscles in his jaw twitched. "What is this?" he asked finally. "It's everything you wanted," I said. "The adventure, the freedom, the chance to start over. Consider it a parting gift." He laughed again, but this time the sound cracked. "You think you can just erase me? Sell my car? Take my money? Hand me a map like some kind of joke?" "I'm not erasing you," I replied. "I'm erasing the version of myself that let you treat me like I didn't matter." His eyes flickered with something I hadn't seen in years. Fear, maybe, or the first sting of realization. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I already regret staying silent for so long." He took a step back, his confidence faltering. For the first time, he seemed unsure of what to say. I could see the anger behind his eyes, but there was something else too, a dawning awareness that the balance between us had shifted for good. He reached for the map at last, his hand trembling slightly. "You really don't want this anymore?" "I wanted it once," I said, "but not like this, not with lies and shame and pretending. You took my dream and tried to turn it into your escape. Now it's yours to carry, alone." He stood there holding the map, his fingers tightening around it. The silence stretched, long and uneasy. Then, his voice low, he asked, "What are you going to do now, Claire?" I smiled faintly. "Live." His expression hardened again. "You'll be nothing without me." I looked at him steadily, my voice barely above a whisper. "On the contrary, without you, I am finally something." He didn't reply. He turned away, muttering under his breath, grabbing his suitcase with unnecessary force. As he walked toward the door, I noticed the faint tremor in his hand, the kind that comes not from anger, but from the sudden realization of defeat. When the door slammed behind him, the house shook slightly, the sound echoing through the rooms like a final punctuation mark. I stood there, breathing in the still air, my body trembling not with fear, but with release. I sat down at the table, the same table where I had once cried quietly after dinner, where I had folded laundry and planned meals and written the first list that began my escape. Now, the surface was bare except for my notebook and the blue pen. I picked it up and wrote one final sentence on the last page. "He left today. The house is quiet again. Only this time, the quiet belongs to me." When I looked up, I realized my eyes were wet. But these were not tears of grief. They were tears of freedom, of something vast and unnamed. Outside, the daisies in the garden swayed gently in the wind. The air was clear, washed clean by the passing storm. I stood and opened the window. The scent of earth and flowers filled the room. The world felt open again, infinite in a way I hadn't known it could be. I didn't need Italy to find myself. I had found her here, in this small house, in the act of standing my ground, in the courage to say no more. The map of Italy was gone from my wall, but the horizon was finally mine. When the door closed behind Richard, I stood for a long time listening to the echo fade into stillness. The silence that followed was unlike any I had ever known. It was not hollow or lonely, it was whole. The quiet no longer frightened me. It wrapped around me like morning light through a window, soft and alive. I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the things that had outlived his presence. Each step felt like a small reclamation of the life I had lost, one compromise at a time. Italy without me wasn't his triumph. It was my beginning. That night, I brewed a cup of tea and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of rain and soil. The garden shimmered under the silver glow of the moon, and the daisies nodded gently in the breeze as if they, too, understood what had just happened. I sat for a while, listening to the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of crickets. I realized I no longer felt the ache to be somewhere else. For years, I had thought freedom meant escape, but now I understood it was presence. It was the ability to breathe inside your own skin without apology. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythms of my life grew gentler. I woke early, sometimes before dawn, when the sky was still a deep shade of blue. I would brew coffee and sit by the window, watching the world shift from darkness to light. The sunrise didn't need to be over the hills of Tuscany to move me. It was enough to see it here, rising above the garden that had grown from my hands. The empty space on the wall where the map of Italy once hung no longer felt like loss. One morning, I placed something new there, a painting of my own. It was a landscape of rolling hills under a golden sky, inspired by my garden but painted in the colors of Tuscany. I had spent weeks working on it at the community center, layering each shade of green and gold, each brushstroke filled with quiet certainty. When I stepped back, I saw not a picture of a place but a reflection of the woman I had become. It was my Italy, created not by travel, but by transformation. I stood before it that morning, coffee steaming in my hand, and smiled. The painting glowed softly in the sunlight. My fingers were still stained faintly with blue paint, the same color as the ink I had used to sign the papers that ended my marriage. Blue, I thought, had followed me all this way, the color of sky, of freedom, of beginnings. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, bringing small gifts from their gardens or asking me to show them my paintings. I welcomed them in. The house, once heavy with unspoken words, was now filled with laughter and warmth. Mrs. Thompson would often tease me that the smell of my coffee could make the whole street feel awake. I would laugh and tell her that maybe I was finally learning how to start the day right. One afternoon, my sister came to visit. We sat together on the porch, two women who had lived through their own storms, sipping tea as the light faded. She looked at me quietly and said, "You seem lighter." "I am," I told her. For a long time, I thought my life ended when he walked away. But now, I see it began the moment I did. She reached over and squeezed my hand. We didn't need many words. Sometimes, peace speaks loudest in silence. There were still moments of reflection, of course. Sometimes, when I watered the daisies or folded laundry, I would think of the years I spent believing that love meant endurance. But instead of bitterness, I felt gratitude for the lessons, for the strength, for the chance to begin again. Pain, I learned, is not the opposite of growth. It is the soil that allows it. The day I finished the painting, I decided to sign it. In the bottom right corner, I wrote my name in small blue letters, Claire Henderson. For decades, I had written that name beside his, on checks, on forms, on holiday cards. This was the first time it stood alone. I hung the painting where the map had once been. Every morning, I would sit with my coffee and let my eyes wander across its colors. The sun would rise through the curtains, catching the brushstrokes, making them shimmer like the surface of water. It felt like watching a living thing, something that kept changing with the light. Sometimes, I imagined him in some distant cafe in Florence, sipping espresso, still chasing approval, still pretending not to see the emptiness beside him. I didn't hate him. I didn't wish him harm. I simply wished him the clarity I had finally found. Because freedom is not revenge, it is release. Now, when I step outside, the mornings greet me like an old friend. The daisies have spread farther across the garden, unplanned and wild, their petals open to the light, just as I have. The breeze carries the scent of coffee and paint, and the hum of life fills every corner of the house that once felt like a cage. I often think about the women who might be listening to this, sitting in their kitchens, on porches, or in quiet rooms of their own. Women who once gave everything they had until they forgot who they were. If you are one of them, I want you to hear this. Do not let anyone tell you that you are too old to start again. Age isn't a wall, it's a doorway. I believed for so long that my worth was measured by what I gave. Now I know it's measured by what I refuse to lose. The courage to stand, to choose, to rebuild, that is what defines us. The sun is rising now, its light spilling across the porch. I sit here with my cup of coffee, the steam curling in the cool morning air. My garden hums softly with life, the petals of the daisies bright as new hope. Inside, the painting glows on the wall, my Tuscany of the heart. I take a slow sip, close my eyes, and breathe. The world feels open again. If Claire's story touched your heart, tell us where you're watching from, and leave a for every woman who chose herself at last. Ending narration, her Italy of the heart. In the end, Claire didn't need to cross an ocean to find herself. She only needed to cross the distance between who she was and who she was meant to be. Freedom, she learned, isn't a place, it's a decision. Sometimes, the bravest journey is the one that leads you back home to yourself. If Claire's story touched something in you, tell us where you're watching from, and share a for every woman who dared to begin again. Don't be afraid to tell your own story, the world needs to hear it. Like this video, share it with someone who needs hope tonight, and subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter so you never miss the next story of courage, dignity, and rebirth. And stay close, because next week, we'll meet another woman whose silence hides a secret that could change everything.